just devastating to watch your lives go away in dumpsters. Sorry.
I honestly was saying every prayer I knew.
Homes destroyed, lives upended as water rushes in. Where there was never water before.
We've been here since '99, and it's just gotten worse and worse as the years have gone on.
The big question:
it's a scary trend and one that we can't escape from.
Why are Middle Tennessee homes now flooding, but didn't in the past?
Well, I'm shocked. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
The WSMV4 Investigates team uncovers the astonishing changes to the Middle Tennessee landscape.
We can no longer continue to rely on historic data.
What our investigation found is causing the crisis.
Our neighbors are going under every time we have a fast, furious, frequent flooding event, which happens more than frequently now.
And the failures that's letting it happen. I'm WSMV4 Chief Investigative Reporter Jeremy Finley, and this is Troubled Waters. Episode 1. The Surge. August 21st, 2021. Rain started falling on the Humphreys County town of Waverly. 24 hours later, 20 people would be dead. It was a Saturday, and heavy rains were forecast in Middle Tennessee, but no one was prepared for how much and how quickly the rain would come. It would be the deadliest one-day flood in the state's history. Waverly resident Michelle Feliciano would lose her 7-year-old daughter in the floodwaters that day.
I constantly remember hearing my daughter's last call out for me, and I couldn't get her.
The number of dead, frankly, took me and everybody by surprise. How could that many people die that quickly from rising floodwaters? I kept thinking, how can that even be possible? After working in Middle Tennessee for more than 19 years as part of the WSMV4 Investigates team, I'd covered my fair share of natural disasters. We have a lot of them. The state is prone to tornadoes and floods. In fact, the number one killer in Tennessee when it comes to weather is tornadoes. The number two, flooding. So I've reported a lot about it, especially since 2010, when Nashville experienced a historic 100-year flood. Much of downtown, entire neighborhoods were all swamped.
I had a young lady walking by crying, saying she didn't want to die like this.
The Cumberland River, which snakes around downtown, swelled from days of rain. I remember interviewing one flood victim. Afterwards, he told me he was confused. He said, "We knew heavy rains were coming, and the water did rise on the Cumberland River and flood our home, and afterwards it started to recede. But then he told me the water rose again." I started making calls, filing Freedom of Information Act requests for emails, and ultimately found out why. The Army Corps of Engineers had to make a game-time decision that weekend. The water upriver had gotten so high behind the Old Hickory Dam that they had to release a lot of it, or the dam could have collapsed. The problem was they didn't tell people that they were releasing so much water into an already swollen river. Here's Austin Acuff. He lost his home in that flood.
Hey guys, look, there's a good chance we're going to open this dam. You've got about 2 hours, 3 hours, 30 minutes to move to higher ground. But we weren't given that. We were given nothing.
People downstream in Nashville who had already flooded were about to flood even more. "11 years later, in tiny Waverly, about an hour and a half from Nashville, people would once again be caught off guard. But this time, there was no dam to release waters, and there are no levees in Waverly. So, what happened? The death toll in Waverly was so astonishing. So many people dead that quickly, including Tracy Kilburn, who lost her husband.
I screamed his name 3 times, and then he went under, and I never saw him again.
At press conferences, law enforcement just kept saying the record amount of rain flooding all of the creeks was responsible for the deaths.
This event didn't occur just on Trace Creek. It's just that's where the population occurred. Blue Creek, some of the other creeks experienced just as devastating flooding.
But I couldn't shake that nagging feeling that something just wasn't right. I started listening to the interviews that were coming in from Waverly from our field crews. One of the most gut-wrenching was Waverly resident Matthew Rignick, who lost twins, a boy and a girl, that day. What he said gave me the first clue about why people didn't get out faster.
We didn't even get a notification that there was a flood coming. It was the worst experience I've ever had.
So cell service had gone down in parts of Humphreys County, meaning phones throughout those areas received none of the National Weather Service's 4 flood emergency alerts.
If we had a better warning to get out of there, our babies would still be here with us.
Anyone who's lived through floods knows it comes like a slow and threatening stranger. In the yard first, maybe reaching the house an hour later, sneaking in inch by inch, swallowing furniture and rising up the walls. And that day, there was a lot of water. 17 inches of rain fell in a 24-hour period. But flood victims were telling us it didn't slowly rise. The water was alarmingly fast. Waverly Police Chief Grant Gillespie said in a news conference that he was hearing the same stories.
Like a dam broke, it just rose. It rose quickly, and maybe a dam breaking would be a sudden rush, but it was a quick rise of water in town.
Here's what you also need to know about Waverly. It is no stranger to flooding. It sits right along Trace Creek. In fact, since 2010, the town has flooded 5 times. It's almost become expected. At least, that's what Lindsay Daniels says. I met her shoveling debris next to her ruined home in downtown Waverly. She says this flood wasn't like any of the rest.
Every other flood we've had time to get our stuff and get out without rushing.
Daniel is kind of a flood veteran at this point, but she and her family were caught so off guard. She says they barely had time to get to their roof.
The water still was rising so fast that my husband actually had to bust out the back window just to let the water flow through, and so we wasn't trapped in there. I compared it to somebody taking a sledgehammer and busting a dam.
I knew first responders would, at the very least, have an idea of what had happened. They'd been out frantically trying to rescue people. I reached the county's Swiftwater rescue team by phone. One of the members told me something might have gone wrong upstream at the railroad tracks and Highway 70. He had to get off the phone pretty quickly. He said he couldn't really say more because it was unclear what had actually happened. So I tracked down railroad maps online. And sure enough, east of Waverly, there are CSX railroad tracks that run somewhat parallel to Trace Creek. And on the other side of the railroad tracks is Highway 70. But that really didn't explain anything. Looking at the map, it was just railroad tracks running between a creek and a flooded highway. But I remembered something else the Swiftwater rescue team member had told me. He said those tracks are raised. When you see it in person, you get it. The railroad tracks are piled up on rock and raised so high off the ground that they look like a levee. The prevailing theory we started hearing from sources is that Trace Creek, again on the other side of the tracks, swollen from all that rainwater, had pooled up against the raised tracks like a berm. The creek does eventually run underneath the tracks through a culvert system, but there was so much water that day, it couldn't all flow through that infrastructure. In other words, it was trapped. Drones have become a real part of how we tell the news every day. It provides us bird's eye views from disasters that can really be hard to fathom from the ground. And just like we would with any natural disaster, we've been droning the town to document how badly the flooding was. So I went to one of our drone operators, photojournalist Jim Garby, and I asked him, did you happen to get any of the video off Highway 70 where it flooded near those railroad tracks? He said, yeah. You want to see it? I remember the moment, looking over his shoulder in the edit bay. He had flown the drone to capture how Highway 70 was just impassable. From the air, the drone's camera looks right down on the tracks. And sure enough, in 2 places, the earth was missing beneath the tracks. At that location, you could see piles of mud streaked across the highway. The water, trapped on the other side, looked like it had pushed through the rock wall, like a broken dam, rushing towards the town. We aired the drone video that night. Almost immediately, I got a text from Humphreys County Sheriff Chris Davis. He wanted to know if I could come to Waverly tomorrow. He said he wanted to show me something. The sheriff picked me up in his pickup truck the next day. He was exhausted. He's local, so he knows everybody in town. And the deaths were really weighing heavily on him. He says to me, let's drive to Highway 70. On the day of the flood, the sheriff says he was further out in the county and had to rush back to Waverly. Highway 70 is not only the easiest way to get there, but in the past heavy rains, water may have pooled, but it was always passable. But on that day, he says there was so much water, there was no way to cross.
What did you think when you were driving here?
Why is there water here now?
As we got closer in the sheriff's pickup, we could see where CSX Railroad was busy repairing the broken earth. I had to ask him an uncomfortable question because I knew he knew some of the victims.
This is what bothers me. Did these people die because of that rush of water, or was it the gradual rise?
There was no gradual rise to this. Up in one of these flood areas, it went from bone dry to waist deep water in somewhere probably less than 15 minutes.
The sheriff said what our drone had captured was correct. In fact, his office had been examining satellite maps and sent up their own drone. The houses and a business across from where the water had burst through looked like they'd just been wiped out.
This is not just a backflow of water that's caused this right here. That had to be some force and some power.
But the real proof wouldn't be found from drones or maps. It would come from surveillance and security cameras. Just a few years ago, reporters felt like we'd won the jackpot if we stumbled across some footage of a natural disaster as it happened. But nowadays, video from doorbell cameras are practically the first thing people post on social media after telling loved ones they're safe. And that's how I found Michael Phillips. He'd posted video of he and his family and how they were immediately trapped by floodwaters in Waverly.
It was so quick, like you think you got enough time to get in your truck and leave, and you don't. And you think you got enough time to go from my house to Main Street, which is probably, 200-300 yards, if that. You just don't have time.
Michael had video from his security camera, and he shared it with us. At first, you see water creep into his yard. Then it's at his porch. 12 minutes from the time water shows up in the video, it's then rushing around his home like a river, carrying cars down the street. 12 minutes. We then got more surveillance video from downtown Waverly. In the beginning of the video, you see cars driving past, one person gets out, walks in her rain boots. In roughly the same time span, about 12 minutes later, water is raging down the street, strong enough to carry a truck and sent a roof floating by. It at last explained why so many people were caught so off guard. The next natural question: could it somehow have been prevented? It is never enjoyable to start asking that question after there's been a tragedy. After all, again, this was the town's 5th flood. Surely there had been talk of what could be done to curtail flooding around the creek. And it turns out there was. And there was also a major problem. "10 years earlier, a report commissioned by Humphreys County officials identified Trace Creek as one of the local hazards for potential deadly flooding. The creek has long been clogged by vegetation and gravel, making it prone to flooding. But that report stated no action was ever taken. And I asked County Executive Jesse Wallace why.
There will be people that say, you knew that this was going to happen. You knew that this could be this bad. Why didn't you clear that creek?
There are a lot of factors that have impeded any progress toward what we know is the major cause of this chronic flooding.
To clear the creek, the county would have had to request permits from the State Department of Environment and Conservation. The state confirmed to us no one ever pulled a permit. I asked Jesse Wallace about that too.
TDEC has said no one ever came to us for permits. Nobody asked for this. Why didn't you ask?
The permits are limited in scope.
And that's where Jesse Wallace says the problem truly lies, that the permits are so limited they couldn't have made a substantial clearing. For example, the county says before 1980, they used bulldozers to clear Trace Creek. But the state permits now don't allow heavy machinery in the creek itself. Once again, here's Jesse Wallace.
Regulatory restrictions are the biggest problem that we have.
I repeatedly called the State Department of Environment and Conservation, but no one would go on camera. The state agency wrote to me, in part, saying there are many mitigation efforts such as removing trash and woody debris by hand or chainsaw that would not require any sort of permit. But Wallace says that would only make a small dent in the problem. So the creek sat, clogged, on a day when 17 inches of rain fell.
It's about justice. That's what we're really seeking here, is justice.
That's attorney Peter Flowers, 9 months after the flood. He was part of a press conference with families of the victims, announcing they were suing.
This was a man-made tidal wave. That's right, man-made tidal wave that came into this town, changing the lives of everyone forever.
I started reading through the lawsuit, and to my surprise, there was a screenshot of our drone footage and our reporting, showing where the earth had broken through under the railroad tracks. The lawsuit claims CSX Railroad had failed to clear debris from their culvert at Trace Creek, essentially clogging the water, causing it to back up behind the tracks, and when the water burst through, it became a deadly surge. Attorneys say the railroad also started diverting trains that morning, knowing the water was rising, but never warned the town. Here's attorney Timothy Potter.
We do believe that there was negligence, and we do believe that this was preventable.
I wanted to ask CSX about all those claims made in the lawsuit, but they denied me an interview, sending a statement that read in part, CSX track and related infrastructure is maintained and regularly inspected in accordance with CSX policies. The lawsuit seeks $450 million in damages. But Waverly is far from the only town in Middle Tennessee where infrastructure just can't keep up with the rain.
How often are you flooding now?
It's been 3 times this year.
Next time on Troubled Waters, the deaths in Waverly come in the middle of a 3-year investigation by myself and my colleagues at WSMV4. And what we found explains why Middle Tennessee is seeing flooding now, where it never had before. Episode 2. The Returning Flood.
No, stop more flooding. Tell Obama vote no, stop more flooding. Tell Obama vote.
Laura Turner is frankly exhausted.
I need to take a break.
I meet her in Franklin. It's a suburb south of Nashville in Williamson County. There's not much of a chance of rain, but she's in rain boots and she's carrying an umbrella, all while wearing a sign reading,
"Turn around, don't drown."
She has protested a lot in her life, but she says she never thought she'd be doing it because of flooding.
This is something that in my wildest dreams I couldn't imagine, because it's simply an issue of public safety.
Stop more flooding!
On this day, Laura is holding signs and a megaphone to gain attention to a proposed mega housing development. It's a development in which many of the homes would be built in a floodplain. So why even consider building in a place deemed to have a higher risk of flooding? Housing in this really popular suburb is so much in demand, developers vowed they could make adjustments to homes to make sure they didn't flood.
Tell Obama vote no. Stop more flooding.
The development and the protest are a microcosm of sorts of a really statewide crisis. So there's been a population boom in Middle Tennessee. And it comes not only as old infrastructure fails, but local and state agencies fail too to act on flood prevention. At the same time, record-breaking storms are intensifying across the state. For the last several years, the investigative unit where I work at WSMV has been devoting a lot of time trying to unravel how the crisis is unfolding. A crisis no more evident than in rural Humphreys County, which is about an hour and a half west of Nashville. And that's where I found Paul Turner. Paul moved to his house really not that long ago. It is right off a main highway. It came with a nice house, a workshop in the back corner of the property, a little creek with a concrete culvert that he can cross on his four-wheeler. It was supposed to be his forever home. Then the flooding started.
A tsunami effect where just anything and everything was destroyed.
Like many people in this county, the huge storm in August of 2021, in which 20 people died in nearby Waverly, also drenched Paul's home. But later, in October, another storm brought 10 inches of water, and it drowned his downstairs den. The ditch and a culvert across the highway are supposed to keep water away from his house. But Paul's own cell phone video shows water surrounding his home in floods. The state-operated culvert is so small and old, it simply can't keep up with all that rainfall.
Well, I think it's simple. I've lost hope.
And just down the street from where Paul lives is where I met Charles Gilreath. I try to pull into his driveway, but there's a chain across it. He apologizes, saying he has to unhook it. Because he doesn't want FedEx drivers to drive in and the driveway collapse. You see, his driveway stands over a creek. And when he bought the house, large amounts of rock supported his driveway, kind of like a bridge. But when you look at it now, huge chunks of the rock are missing. He says the water is so strong through the creek, the foundation has been washed away.
I don't want nobody driving down in that driveway collapsing on them.
At Charles's house, it turns out a different state-operated culvert across the highway is also too small to handle the floodwaters that back up and drowned his property. 2 people off the same highway with flood mitigation that's failing. I called Rebecca Hammonds with the Tennessee Department of Transportation. It's the state agency in charge of the culverts. Is this an example of TDOT just not planning appropriately to handle this water?
I think that's a tough question.
Episode 3. The fallout. For years, myself and my colleagues on our investigative team would hear from our viewers stuff like, my house is flooding, my yard is flooding, and I don't know why I'm not in a floodplain. As we mentioned last episode, leaders in cities across Middle Tennessee kept pointing to higher than usual rain totals or outdated stormwater infrastructure for being the problem. And our investigation found that does contribute. But what we also uncovered strikes at the very heart of the question in homeowners' minds. If I don't live in a floodplain, why am I flooding? Turns out, for many of them, they did live in floodplains and just never knew. And that's how we met Michael Hausman.
I remember getting into the water. It was so cold, so cold.
Michael lives in the South Nashville neighborhood of Creve Hall. He, his wife Margaret, and their children had to wade through water waist deep in March of 2021 when heavy rains flooded their home. Here's Margaret.
I honestly was saying every prayer I knew.
But here's the thing about the Hausmans' home. When they bought it, it wasn't in a floodplain, but it's still flooded. And I kept hearing that from other homeowners in Middle Tennessee, from towns like Manchester and Laverne. In fact, when Melissa Fotorath bought her brand new home, she said developers advised her not to worry.
They did say several times, it's not in the floodplain, it's not in the floodplain.
But when she moved into that brand new house, it started flooding so often she felt like she'd bought an island instead.
It looks like we're in the middle of a river, flowing water in front and back.
When you buy a house, especially in areas like Middle Tennessee, one of the first things you consider is whether or not it's in a floodplain. The problem is, no one ever really looks at the maps themselves. If they had, they'd seen what we found. A lot of them are old. We're talking more than a decade old. Gwen Frazier lives in Laverne, right on the edge of a floodplain. When she floods, it swallows her entire backyard. The last time her flood map was updated was 2007.
All of this was completely underwater. It's a major problem. I feel like we've been misled.
Melissa Fotorath, that we just talked about, she was just as frustrated. She too lived near a floodplain, but not in it. I told her that the flood map near her home is 12 years old. Do you think this home should have been built on this land at all?
Oh no, definitely not.
So we turned to the source, FEMA, and senior engineer Mark Vieira. Because these maps are so old, does that indicate that these neighborhoods shouldn't have been built there in the first place?
That's a good question.
Vieira knows FEMA is ultimately responsible for the floodplain maps. Some of the maps we found are 12 years old. Is that acceptable?
If you look at the criteria, there's a possibility, yes, that's okay.
Vieira says sometimes floodplains expand, sometimes they don't, especially if the terrain doesn't really change. But that's not the case for Nashville and its suburbs. We are seeing a population boom in Middle Tennessee, and there is a real rush to build. Construction that is paving over grass means there's less soil to absorb rain. And developers are moving closer and closer to floodplains, using outdated maps to determine what does and doesn't have a higher chance of flooding.